Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our event this evening. This is the first time we've done an online event via Teams for Digital Futures, although we've done other events in other places, so we're hoping it's just as straightforward. Let's see. Hopefully this will run fairly smoothly, we think. I'm just going to begin with a few notices. So I'm Professor Kate Devlin. I'm Chair Director of the Digital Futures Institute here at King's. Tonight we've got a panel on the digital futures of security. This event is being recorded and we're going to share it on our YouTube channel when we've finished. Only the speakers have access to the microphones this evening. So if you have questions, and we hope you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A, not in the chat. We'll be checking the Q&A frequently to make sure we've got your questions, and then I can put them to the panelists. We've also enabled the chat feature just in case you can't use the Q&A, but please don't use it for anything else. But just if you can't use that Q&A feature, then you can put your questions in the chat and the moderator will move that over to the Q&A for you. After the event, we'd really love your feedback. We'll share a link to our feedback form as well. So, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to getting started. The Digital Futures Institute was launched back in 2023 with the tagline, Living Well with Technology, and that's a theme we're exploring in our monthly talks. The DFI exists to connect academics across and outside of King's and to convene research and education and impact, to encourage collaboration, to create new projects and to communicate the results of these to wider audiences. And so we're really delighted to have you join us for this evening's panel discussion, where we're going to be exploring the intersections of defence, technology, cybersecurity and international politics in an increasingly digitised world. So joining us this evening are three distinguished experts who each bring a unique perspective shaped by years of experience and their research. So first we have Tony Reeves. Tony is strategic lead for AI in defence and a partner at Deloitte. He has over 30 years of experience in defence and national security and has served as a British Army officer, as a government advisor and a business leader, and leads Deloitte's UK and NATO digital defence practice and is at the forefront of integrating AI into defence strategies globally. His work has shaped the modern defence landscape across multiple continents. And we're also delighted to welcome Tony back to King's because he's an alumnus of the Department of War Studies, where he did his master's. We're also joined by Professor Claudia Aradau. She is Professor of International Politics in the Department of War Studies. Claudia is currently leading the ERC-funded Security Flows project, investigating how digital technologies are reshaping security and surveillance in today's world. Her work critically examines the politics of data and algorithms and the ways in which they transform the relationship between security and democracy. And last but not least, we welcome Professor Luca Vigano. Luca is head of the cybersecurity group in the Department of Informatics here at King's College London. And Luca's research lies at the intersection of formal cybersecurity analysis and explainable cybersecurity. He's particularly interested in how storytelling can demystify complex cyber threats and defences. And he is also a playwright. And he helps both experts and non-experts make sense of the digital challenges that we face. So a big welcome to all of our panellists. So like I was saying, feel free to post questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to see if I can stop my slides for a second. Possibly not. There we go. Already we've hit the technological limits. So we'll keep that up for a moment. But I want to turn to each panelist in turn and ask them this first question, which is, how do you define security in the digital age? Has this shifted or evolved over your career in light of AI, in light of cyber threats or shifting geopolitical landscapes? And let me come to Tony first for that.
Thank you, Kate. I'm delighted to be here. You come to me first with two professors, one of whom is a specialist in security, so please don't mark my homework once I've come up with a definition. I think to a great extent, security is still pretty much the same in intent, even if in my career we seem to have gone from confronting Russia in Europe to wandering around the globe and now return to confronting Russia again. Security is still that ability for an individual or a society to make their own decisions and actions without undue influence or pressure from others. I can make a decision because I am secure, and if I'm insecure, it's so much harder to make a decision or take an action. And that involves, politics, social, environmental security, whether single person or society. We need that security across a whole range. It's more than just I've got a big army or a big stick in my repertoire. And sometimes we do see people who want to feel secure by eliminating threats within their own community and by threatening others, especially other countries, either to remove a perceived threat or just to stop threats appearing. So I guess that this impact on the communities also means that security is relative, isn't it? That one side increases the threat, then the other has to change to remain secure. And perhaps when I first joined the army many years ago, we had parity with Russia as a potential threat, and now perhaps we'd look at it and say, well, we've had a period where we haven't been maintaining security to the same level as perhaps we now feel we do need. Digitally, I think that we probably now struggle to attribute the threats. It's harder to see a digital attack, and I'm sure Luca will cover this about that attribution of a cyber attack. The ability, when you get invaded, it's obvious it's somebody from another country in your country. But when a digital attack takes place, whether that's like Estonia in 2007 or current attacks globally, it's much harder to identify an attribute. And would we feel that we should respond militarily to a digital attack? I'm not entirely sure. So it's much harder to do so. So I think security hasn't changed much, but it has. The way that we influence others certainly has.
Let me pick up on that then and go to Luca. So Luca, in particular, you're looking at cybersecurity. So what does security mean to you? How has that changed over the years?
Thank you. So I was taking notes while Tony was speaking, because I think it's very interesting. So I agree with Tony that security hasn't changed much, but the world has changed. And I'm talking in particular about cybersecurity. Obviously, about global security, it's slightly different, and it's interesting that we're back at Russia. But I'm old enough, I think I'm the oldest in the panel by far, and I'm old enough to remember when to go online, you had to go somewhere. I had to go to my university to be able to access data online. And these days, everybody has one of these, sorry if you can see it, a mobile phone in our pockets, and we're online all the time. And this is fantastic if you think about it, in terms of democratization of knowledge and access to knowledge, and the ability to be connected with the rest of the world, the ability to do all our business online. And I'm talking about proper business by companies, but also, individual businesses. I do my tax returns in the UK and in Italy fully online. When I started dealing with cybersecurity, you actually had to go physically to an office with the paper copy and hand it in. This means that while providing fantastic new services, we have opened up a huge amount of new vectors or opportunities or doors for attack. So this has radically changed in the 30 years in which I've been looking at security. Security, cybersecurity in particular, I should say. Cybersecurity 30 years ago was still already a very big issue, but it pertained only to a small subset of people. It pertained to governments, to military, and to those who really had some assets that they needed to protect online. Nowadays, every single one of us has assets online because our life is online. And so we need to protect that. And that is challenging, especially when suddenly you have humans in the mix. I'm not going to use the dreaded wording humans in the loop, but they are in the loop. And obviously, these humans are not necessarily trained to secure a system or to be part of the security of a system. So the opportunity to attack humans rather than machines or rather than institutions is completely new with respect to 30 years ago. And AI has caused, and we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but AI has caused a huge amount of additional issues because people, of course, have jumped on the opportunity to use AI as a companion in your daily life, to help you, without understanding, for instance, the huge amount of data that we reveal to the AIs and to the companies that handle the AIs and that offer us the AIs for free. And that is not something that I believe people are realizing very well. So a very, very different landscape from the point of view of cybersecurity, a very exciting one because there are new fantastic opportunities, but obviously one, like Tony was saying, where understanding where an attack is coming from, who is attacking you, why they are attacking you is suddenly much, much more complicated than many years ago.
Thank you. And Claudia, if I can bring you in, because you're coming to this from a very a critical political analysis of security. So what does it mean to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. Indeed, I think I have some points of connection and maybe some things, kind of a slightly different lens in the sense in which a lot of the research that I'm coming from in critical security studies has tried to understand security actually as a political process, right? So we haven't had the same security issues, the same threats and dangers all the time, but even now we have a multitude of threats and dangers that we are facing. And security as a political process or as a process of securitization kind of implies a selection and a prioritization of some threats over others, right? If you want a deprioritization of other threats, a devaluing of some, I always think of the question of domestic violence, right? So at which point something that was completely invisible becomes visible, but then it becomes governed in a particular way, it becomes a matter of policing, but then we have it contested, right? As kind of policing has its own limitations. But we can think of other examples, similar examples. We can think of environmental security, for instance, or health security, border security, and so on. And I think once we take this political process, we can ask critical questions about what gets deprioritized and what gets devalued. Now, the second I would say, so from where I am sitting and the way I'm looking at security as this political process, I have seen in the past decades an extraordinary expansion of security to engulf more and more political problems, to the extent that a lot of our language of understanding and approaching social and political problems becomes one of security. And I think this is also reinforced in the digital age through what Luca, you're talking about, the kind of huge amounts of data. And I think that's something really important about the kinds of data that are collected, because it is not the data, it is not the statistics, the state. There are so many kinds of data that we are producing all the time. And I would like to argue that what is different is that all this data is potentially security data. And that has really important implications for example, any private company working with data using these digital technologies becomes also a security company. But also there's a way in which our traditional security actors want to be big data actors as well. They want to kind of govern their processes, become big data actors exactly because they use all this data. And we can see now how all this data in all the controversies, for example, in the US around the role of ICE and the kind of very different forms of data that are used, we can see that data that was never intended, has nothing to do with security. Right, has never intended for security, is actually used to target people for the purposes of security. So I think in that sense, we can see this huge expansion of security, but also this potential of infusing security, right, or infusing all our data with kind of security questions and problems.
And in fact, only this week, we've seen news about OpenAI signing a deal with the UK to use their AI in public services. So again, another lens on it. And I think now that we've set the boundaries for this discussion incredibly wide, let me go back to Luca. Luca, we're hearing more and more stories in the news about cyber attacks, whether it's shops like Marks and Spencer or the Co-op, but or airports being attacked. We are now living in a world where we rely really, really heavily on this digital infrastructure, like you were saying. We've got the NHS, we've got the national grid. How prepared is the UK for a large-scale cyber attack? What are our vulnerabilities there?
We're better prepared than other countries, but we're not fully prepared. And the reason for that is one that is totally understandable. I mean, much of our infrastructure relies on legacy systems. So let me explain. When we built our infrastructures, and I'm thinking in particular, I don't know, the railway system, we built it way before the internet, right? And then suddenly we had the internet, we had the opportunity to go online, but we also wanted at the same time the trains to keep going, right? So we couldn't just say, okay, and now for the next 3 months, there are not going to be any trains in the UK while we refurbish the whole system so that it runs on new perfect devices. Not only it's a matter of time, it's also a matter of costs. This means, and I've given the example of the railway, but I could similarly give the example of the NHS. Some of you will remember, I think it was 2017, the WannaCry worm that basically shut down the NHS for a number of days. And part of the reason for that is that people were using legacy operating system versions of Microsoft Windows simply because changing the operating system, updating the operating system would have meant that some of the things that the hospitals were relying on would not work anymore. It's a bit more complicated than that, but believe me, that was one of the reasons. So we have these systems that are very, very new, that use technology and other systems that are very, very old. This means that it's actually very difficult to achieve security. I mean, first of all, full security does not exist. And by the way, when I talk about security, I always talk about cybersecurity. It's different from the political security and geopolitical security. But cybersecurity, full cybersecurity, 100% cybersecurity does not exist. There are some mathematical reasons for that. But still, we could get a very high degree of cybersecurity, but it is expensive. And it is very, very difficult to achieve because you would need constant monitoring. So we are getting better, and the UK is better prepared than other countries. And this is thanks to the huge investments, by GCHQ, by NCSC, by the research councils, by the government and everything, by the different organizations. But still, we are going to be subject of large-scale cyber attacks. This is unavoidable because it's interesting to attack us. And we should consider also that in many cases, hackers do attack not to gain something. It's not necessarily always a ransomware. It's not necessarily always a geopolitical attack. In many cases, it's an attack for the sake of an attack or just to see what happens. So legacy systems, you asked about vulnerabilities. I would say the cohabitation of legacy systems and new technologies is one of the vulnerabilities, and it's one that it's very, very difficult to solve. It takes time and it takes a lot of money to upgrade all our systems. The other issue, as I was saying earlier already, are people. Because suddenly with everybody online, everybody is essentially responsible for cybersecurity, and people are not trained. They don't understand, and rightfully so. Why should everybody suddenly become a cybersecurity expert? It's not going to happen, right? Even if people dedicate time, it's not an easy thing to do. And that means that there are many entry points, many different entry points. And you mentioned earlier on that much of the work that I do is on explaining cybersecurity, and that is trying to mitigate that problem so that people understand cybersecurity without having to become an expert. But we need to find ways to reach out to people and talk to them in a way that is not just patronizing, where we tell them, okay, and now suddenly you need to learn this new cryptography algorithm, but rather to make them feel part of the solution and not just part of the problem. They are part of the problem. We are all part of the problem, but we need also to become part of the solution. So that is the biggest vulnerability, that transition that we need to make sure that people understand what they're doing. For instance, when they're sending an email, when they're shopping online, when they are using an AI, and how much data they reveal, like Claudia was saying, and everything. And then the amount of data that we actually give out for free is very, very scary.
And just thinking about that and about the AI use. So we're seeing a lot of push from tech companies to embrace AI agents, agentic AI. I mean, this involves handing over some control to these AI agents. Is that going to put us even more at risk?
Possibly, especially if the AIs are controlled by enterprise rather than by governments and regulation. I mean, I'm not in favor of a government controlling everything. This is not what I'm saying. But we need third-party supervision. I don't want company, and I was about to say company X, but now they changed name to Twitter, so I can't say company X. I don't want company Y to give me the AI and also control the security and the cybersecurity of their AI. I would want a third party, some experts, a panel of experts, some regulation to tell company Y, great, sell your AI or give it out for free. It doesn't matter, as you wish. But we are going to check that it is secure, that data privacy is ensured, and all these things. And we are lagging a little bit behind, even though here again, the UK is very much at the forefront of these discussions, at the very least.
And Luca, if I can jump in,
so
I think the other bit in there, of course, is people understand how it works, because quite often it's the person who's configured it wrong or used it wrong which has created the vulnerability. And we all have to understand AI and agentic AI and all these terms much better than we do as a society.
Oh, agreed. Maybe we can help with that with digital futures. I hope so. Well, Tony, while we've got you there, that AI is then becoming embedded deeply in decision making and defense. How can we ensure we have accountability, control, ethical use? Because the stakes are really high here.
Yeah, and Kate, that's another really big question. And I think that conferences like responsible ethical AI in military, REAIM, spend days discussing this stuff. I guess whenever I talk about that question, the first thing is I should probably reassure people. I'm not entirely sure what the mix of the audience is, but nobody is putting AI in charge of nuclear weapons. We're still a long way off from the 1983 film War Games, although I think probably Luca and I are the only two old enough to remember that film, a reference for us at least. But I think that we are certainly seeing this increase in AI across defense. So at a tactical level, it's being built into munitions, into drones, into weapon systems, into rifle sights. We've had AI in rifle sights for over a decade. Simple but still effective. Targeting systems, command and control, surveillance. It really is spreading everywhere in the military, with concerns obviously raised. However, the ethical adoption and deployment is something that's been at the forefront of this adoption. Back in 2015, I remember speaking to seniors in the British Army and being told, AI, 15, 20 years away. Why are we bothering talking about AI now in 2015? A year before Transformers were invented and 2 years before GPT was invented. So I think that the military who were interested had nothing to do because they had no AI to play with. So they spent a lot of time thinking about, well, when it turns up, what do we do to make sure it's ethical, responsible, sensibly adopted? And so as a result, I mean, from NATO, all the member states, certainly the Western military has spent the last decade preparing for an age with AI, with guidance, standards, templates, patterns, models to make sure that it can be tested. And now that it's being deployed and operated, we have got that thinking available and being implemented. We're, for instance, DSTL in that wonderfully, Defence Science Technology Laboratory is the research arm of the UK MOD. In that wonderfully British way, has a biscuit book about responsible AI. It's called a biscuit book because you should have a nice cup of tea and a good biscuit whilst you read it. And it's designed not for the geeks and the techies like me, but for the average, officer, the average leader, the average soldier to read, have a think about, have a nice biscuit, and get a feel for what they should and shouldn't be doing. And so we are implementing, this at every level, from, as I said, NATO strategy all the way down to the operators being told, these are concerns, this is what you should think about, this is how, as we just discussed, how AI works. I think if I could add on that, though, the one thing I do worry about is not necessarily a war with AI. I worry a war over AI. We're already seeing AI being deployed effectively as a strategic weapon. Both Presidents Biden and President Trump have put restrictions on GPU sales, the hardware that drives our AI capabilities. There's restrictions and sanctions on rare earths. There's probably going to be more disputes about power and water to drive AI. And as we're seeing AI give a military advantage, being a strategic advantage for the users, one of the big causes of conflict is often one country feeling they're falling so far behind another country that a war seems the only option to try and catch up or to peg back that opponent. So much as I worry about AI on a tactical field being misused, there are so many controls being implemented, it is being adopted safely. But I do worry at a bigger level that we probably will have a war over AI using strategic AI rather than a war concern with AI. I started reassuring people. I think I feared possibly making people feel less sure at the end of that sentence. So.
Well, I think you make it sound reassuring from one particular area, but what happens when people don't play by those rules? So we can say that we have all the reassurance and responsibility and accountability here on our side, but what happens when you have states that won't engage on that kind of way?
Yeah, and I think that there's always that concern, and you probably remember 2017 and the responsible AI processes and that concern at once. If you look at drone devices being deployed in Ukraine, what happens when they're being misappropriated or used against civilian targets or similar? That is a deep concern, and this is where we do need international society, and as we were also aware, the rule of law and that international agreements are increasingly being threatened. And this is one area, AI in particular, where without that international consensus about that's unacceptable, without being able to call on some legislation or the Geneva Convention and say, look, that is a war crime if you use AI like that. I've campaigned for a decade that we should have a Tallinn manual in the same way we have for the use of cyber capability in conflict, to say that this is, from a legal perspective, will be constituted as a war crime for cyber warfare. We probably should have the same for a war crime for AI deployments in conflict, and adhere that and introduce a new Tallinn manual to do so.
Thank you. And Claudia, this gets into your kind of territory, and I want to ask you, there seems to be a tension at play here between safety and security and civil liberties, and national security policies increasingly are incorporating data collection and surveillance. How can we balance national security with civil liberties and with democratic accountability?
So I'm thinking that maybe my answer is going to be unsatisfactory, because I'm going to say we cannot balance, right? So I started from this idea that you always have to prioritize, right? So it's kind of, in terms of security, what is prioritized? And there is something similar that's going on in the question of balance between security and civil liberties, but we've also seen a kind of integration, right, and solidification of questions of security. So more and more issues come under the umbrella of security. Well, if you look at civil liberties, right, to have a sort of fragmentation. So think of, we kind of have privacy, but privacy is not an absolute right. So therefore, you can think of necessity and proportionality. So in a sense, once you start fragmenting the civil liberties and kind of split them and look at particular rights, while security kind of becomes more kind of solidified, the other ones become more fragmented. So you can't really have a balance. Right. So in a sense, freedoms are often going to lose out in this kind of discourse of balance. But I think we can turn it around to the question. I think, Tony, you're also talking about, kind of ethical concerns, like accountability. We can turn it around questions of oversight, right? And the kind of institutions that we have in democracies, the forms of civil society involvement that are, part of oversight, but also, for instance, the role of employees, the role of workers in different companies. But also we have a history of oversight, really interesting in the UK. GCHQ was mentioned, right? The kind of strikes at the GCHQ and the formation of trade unions of the GCHQ were key elements in terms of, oversight and what can be done and what should be done. So at the time of the strikes, some of the trade unions leaders said there's no oversight done by the workers themselves, right? Because there's so much secrecy around security and so on. And we can see now actually workers in different companies. Of course, we had the case of Google and Project Maven that kind of went away, right? Google changed its mind in terms of, a lot has changed in the world as well. But there is something about the role of workers, right? So that decides of what I would call democratic contestation, right? Where it's a question of what are these processes, what is prioritized and what is kind of devalued and what are the implications on democracy. And we can see that, for example, also in mobilization by civil society to actually support and to have legislation that protects whistleblowers, right? So the role of whistleblowers is a kind of really important way in which these relations between security and civil liberty, security and democracy actually play out, because the whistleblowers can throw this alert, right, and make us aware of the kinds of wrongdoings that take place. But also more broadly, we have had civil society campaigns, civil society mobilization. So I started actually working on some of these issues around surveillance in the wake of the Snowden disclosure, so back in 2013. But then we had in the UK a big campaign that was called Don't Spy on Us, right? We also now have campaigns, for instance, around rights, digital rights, rights and borders, and again, the hashtag, that's still a hashtag, right? We can't escape the hashtag anymore, just protect, not surveil, right? So these are democratic processes and kind of forms of trying to institutionalize and bring change to shape these processes of prioritization, deprioritization, what is valued and what becomes devalued. And it's having this in a sense, processes that can take time, right? So often AI is introduced and promoted as leading to automated kind of speedier decisions, more accuracy and so on. But with democratic processes, all these forms, if you think of campaigns, of mobilization, of whistleblower, they are quite slow, they take time, they're forms of deliberation, forms of contestation. So there are interesting tensions here that I think we need to bear in mind. So on the positive side, I think there is a lot going on, right, in terms of civil liberties and in terms of democracy. Of course, there's also a lot of pessimism, but I won't get to the kind of more pessimist side now. I kind of keep to this effervescence, if you want, of democratic institutions.
I mean, it's quite tempting, isn't it, to go down the pessimistic route, because there's a lot to be pessimistic about. But from what you're saying, there are ways that we, as workers, as citizens, can try and enforce control upwards. But are we then doing the job of the governments? Should they not be regulating all of this, all of the whole AI thing? We're in a world where really the main source of AI regulation resides in the EU, a bit in China. So I'm going to open this question to all of the panel, but we don't have regulation specifically in place around AI. Should we even have an oversight body or a legal framework specifically around security, or should there be something more widely at play here?
Well, I'll jump in straight away, because my worry about, as a Munich conference early in the year, and is telling that the European and the American sides were really falling out over AI. The Americans were looking at the Europeans and saying, if you're going to regulate it, you're not going to exploit it, and therefore you're irrelevant. And the Europeans are saying, but we have to have regulation, because where we don't have regulation, we also have disadvantage and unfairness and behaviors that we don't want and we don't encourage. So I think that it's a real difficult place between encouraging innovation and being regulated. But my biggest concern is that if we rely, as you said, Kate, just on governments to regulate, they take so long to do this. And if you look at the GDPR regulations coming in, they started those in 2012 to start coming in. A decade later, they finally introduced them. It takes too long to agree what we should regulate. And by the time we've agreed what we should regulate, the technology has moved on so far, it's irrelevant. And I think that unless we are oddly going to use AI to accelerate the regulation process, unless we're going to look at radical solutions like that, we'll always play catch up and be too late, and therefore not be relevant to actually the problem that's facing society.
Thank you. Luca or Claudia, would you like to come in on that?
I can jump in very quickly. I mean, I agree with Tony. I think that there is a middle ground, though, and especially in the UK. I mean, the UK is in a very interesting position. Okay, we have left the EU, but still we should not forget that we have not left Europe. So it's very important, to be also conscious of our geopolitical position and everything. So the fact that we have EU law is not a bad thing. But at the same time, I totally agree with you that, left in the hands of politicians, it might take too long. And this is where the UK, with the unbelievable amount of expertise that we have in AI, and I'm thinking about academia, of course, because I'm an academic, but also I'm thinking about, companies and organizations and everything. There is a huge amount, wealth of expertise in AI. And those people should be involved more in the discussion. We actually have quite a lot of expertise in security and in cybersecurity. And again, an opportunity to have people involved in the discussion. Obviously, that would mean that the government would need to delegate some of the powers, but it can work in a slightly quicker way. The alternative is the Wild West, right? The alternative is whoever draws first and shoots first wins. And that is very, very dangerous.
And Lucas, building on that, one area where I think we need more involvement is by trade unions and union bodies. TUC wrote a brilliant paper in 22, which is working with dignity with AI, and increasingly, and I say this as as a consultant, increasingly the people making decisions are governments, employers, and large institutions, and employees don't always have a say, or when they do, it's a good organization. They're probably not going to do anything irresponsible. So I think trade unions also have to be engaging on this topic because they are representatives of most of the workers in many parts of society.
Claudia, do you feel that the trade unions are getting a good say in this? Are they being listened to? Is it people being heard?
I'm not sure, but I do agree. I do agree with Tony that I think trade unions have an important role to play, and that's part of what I call the democratic institutions. I do think we have forms of regulations and institutions in place. We have a lot of oversight institutions. If we think even of the national data protection authorities, we have different modes of oversight in the UK. That there have been kind of a lot of changes, but different inspectors, surveillance camera commissioners. We have the investigatory powers commissioner's office. So, under the Investigatory Powers Act. So we actually have, if we look around, right, kind of biometrics, we do have a lot of institutions that have a role in oversight, right? So it's not that we have to have all the time kind of new regulation, but there is a question also of the extent, as we were talking at the beginning, the extent of the use of data. So, for example, under the Investigatory Powers Act a few years ago, when I was looking at it, there were over 600 organizations kind of, having powers under the Act. So imagine the extent of oversight. And then there's also the question of resources. So one of the things that often comes up, particularly in relation to national data protection authorities, in the EU, but I think it is also more broadly, are that they are often under-resourced, right? So we ask them to do, to play a role in democracy, but without actually resourcing them adequately, right? So therefore we see extremely slow processes that are not processes of regulation or legislation, but they are processes of oversight, and this is partly due to the lack of resources.
And I'm actually, at this point, there's a really good question that relates to this when you talk about resourcing. So Kieran has asked, information security is a resource intensive activity, and both private and public organizations have become more and more security conscious over the past 20 plus years, putting more and more resources into security, trying to stay ahead of threat actors. With the advent of AI, does the panel see a future in which we'll all have to get used to more and more breached data sets in the public domain? Or will organizations continue to apply more and more resources into security? Maybe we'll be forced to really think hard about which data sets we care about securing. Anybody want to pick up on that?
Or maybe also obliged to care about. That to me is part of the solution, right? So again, I have mixed feelings about giving my data to a company, but if in return I get a service, okay, it could be a fair deal. But what I would also want is some kind of guarantee how my data is going to be used and how my data is going to be kept secure. And this is where we certainly lack regulations, at least in certain activities, not everywhere, but in certain activities, and it goes beyond GDPR, so the data protection rights and everything. It goes beyond that, but there is a discussion there, yeah, right. So who is responsible? Which is kind of the dual side of attribution. Who is responsible if data is stolen? So not just who has stolen it, but who is responsible.
Well, and in 2 days' time, we see the Online Safety Act taking hold, and age verification will come in. And this is not initially spun very much as we're keeping children safe. You won't be able to access porn without age verification, but it's not just porn. It's anything deemed to have an adult content in it. It could be a discussion on Reddit. It could be someone posting on Blue Sky and they've used sexual words, for example. And those age verification checks are being outsourced often to third-party companies. I mean, this is slightly scary, but again, this is what you're saying. Are we? Who's going to take the blame if suddenly that data goes? And it could be an overseas company that does that. So yes, beware, be ready in a couple of days' time to have your credit card on standby, or get a really good VPN. That's
just building on what Lucas said, and the age verification thing. With 15 minutes left, we're probably going to spend all of that just discussing that topic. But Lucas said, I think sometimes as well we do forget just how beneficial and useful AI is in many things. And I mean, when I was in Microsoft, a decade ago, we were using 95-96% of all of the security built into Microsoft was artificial. It wasn't humans working in cybersecurity centers. Of course, there were some, but most of the activities were automated because they had to be, because of the pace of change and the scale and the complexity of a global network. And I think that, yes, we might need to look about which data sets we really care about securing. But AI will help us do that. It'll help us find vulnerabilities. It'll stop us putting all our data sets into a bucket and making it publicly accessible on the internet. It will tell us that in a much better way, as long as we set it up and use it properly. But AI will help with these things. So yes, we are going to be doing more. There will be more vulnerabilities, but there should also be fewer breaches using artificial intelligence. That's my positive message about AI.
It's very positive. I appreciate the positive sentiment there. Please, in the audience, please do add your questions to the Q&A. We'd love you to put some questions to the panel. Just continuing along the resourcing line, the funding landscape is definitely shifting, and we've seen the current government shift from calling it the AI Safety Institute to renaming it the AI Security Institute. So it's clear that it's a priority. And academics everywhere seem to be pivoting to make sure their research falls under priority areas like defence and like healthcare and sustainability. Very recently, Peter Kyle has told the Alan Turing Institute they should be focusing on defence. Are we getting that investment balance right, or will things lose out because of this focus on defence and security? Anyone want to take that? Perhaps Claudia?
I think, at first sight, one could say, is there such a big difference between safety and security? To some extent, we can say yes. So we had this kind of debates where we can say, well, there's a particular kind of socio-technical, more of an engineering approach to safety, if you want. So we can think of aviation safety and aviation security, right? So kind of rise in aviation security as a particular political moment. So I think Luca was talking about political security. So we can see some of these differences, and there's no doubt that the shift towards security is kind of in a changing geopolitical context, and it's kind of gestures towards that. At the same time, it's a kind of field, right? The safety and security, we can also use them interchangeably, right? And the kind of everyday language, we don't necessarily strongly differentiate them. So I wonder whether the difference is in the shift as much as in the shift between AI safety and AI security, or the shift happened actually earlier on. So if you think also in the debates, what happened to AI ethics and the shift from AI ethics to also questions of AI safety, where AI safety was formulated in a particular manner where it was actually the existential risk that took over rather than the everyday risks, right, that were kind of not seen to be, the important ones. And now we have the kind of the geopolitical reading of security that takes over. And again, I think kind of looking at it in this history kind of get us to ask questions about what happened then. Where is AI ethics now when you have security? Does it come back in? Is it subsumed to security? Then what kind of AI ethics do we have? But also, where are the people who are doing the AI ethics, right? Where are they? And I think that's your question about the investment, the landscape, what is happening, and how different experts are positioning themselves. So who is doing now AI security, or who is and who is not doing AI ethics? Or is it the security actors who are doing now ethics? Have they been doing? I mean, Tony was saying they've been doing it for many years. I mean, of course, ethics and war has been a long-standing concern, but at the same time, scholars have also said that through the introduction of ethics in war, we have actually had more violent or different forms of violence that are made possible rather than less violence, right? This kind of violence that becomes is made possible differently, but it's not stopped, right? So we can think about all of these questions. So I would add, I would add ethics to this shift between from AI safety to AI security.
And I'll quickly throw in you. I work in defence and security. I welcome NATO saying we should be spending 3.5% of GDP plus 1.5% on critical national infrastructure and security and making us safer as a society. But I'd be really disappointed if somebody with a brilliant idea around AI decided, I'm going to go and sell it into defence and not do it in another part of society as well. Defence is really bad at taking innovation and rolling it out at pace. It's really bad at deploying stuff at pace. And why I got into AI was because the potential to change people's lives with AI is enormous. Whether it's we are all coders, and the whole of Western society is based on software, and the people who could code have a real advantage for the last 30 years because they could code. Well, now everybody can code. That's an amazing change because we can now have a brilliant idea and do something with it, when before we had to have a brilliant idea and know somebody who could code. So I think that I'd be really disappointed if the shift became defense first for our innovation, for our AI, and for our investment, because it's not the best use of our investments and our ideas in society.
And just when you say that about now everyone can code, this reminds me of the cybersecurity initiative, where we're having ballerinas retrain as cybersecurity experts, according to the government adverts. Luca, you've watched storytelling around that, and it's been a very successful thing in the cybersecurity community to take the kind of concept of the hooded hacker and move to this new everyone can do cyber type of thing. So how important has storytelling been to that?
I think it's incredibly important. I think digital literacy is our biggest threat, but also the pathway that we should take to ensure security, or to ensure a better cybersecurity. So the fact that we tell stories about security, the fact that we kind of normalize it, and as you were saying, we say everybody can play their part, everybody can become an expert with enough study, or everybody can play a role. I think that is fundamental. And illiteracy is the real problem. There are many companies, for instance, jumping on AI as a fantastic new opportunity, and I would agree with all the positives that Tony mentioned, but in many cases even the companies are not literate enough. So we need to change the narrative. We need to change the language. We need to make sure that people understand the risks, yes, but they also understand, as I was saying earlier on, that people can be part of the solution or need to be part of the solution. And companies need to be part of the solutions, and government and the military and all the different institutions need to be part of the solution. Otherwise, we'll never reach an acceptable degree of cybersecurity.
So there are stories to be told around this
Absolutely.
still. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
it's not yet one.
And for instance, one thing that I notice has changed over the last few years is the fact that until recently, and it's still the case, but many companies, when they were a victim of an attack, they didn't tell anyone, right? And now, because they were afraid that they would lose their customers, which in many cases they did. And so it was like being a victim of a crime where you are ashamed that you were a victim. Now the narrative there is changing a little bit. I mean, part of it is regulations, but part of it is also the fact that, it happens, and it is much better for the world if we talk about it rather than if we not talk about it. And that has encouraged many companies. You were mentioning Marks and Spencer earlier on. I mean, they've been kind of secretive about it, but then in the end, they actually revealed quite a lot. So companies are much more open to explaining or to talking about what has happened to them, so that we can learn from it and we can remedy it. Because I'm quite sure that if it happened to Marks and Spencer, it has happened to at least 5 other similar companies in the past, but they didn't tell us about it. And now we talk about it much more, and normalizing it and really changing the narrative is part of the solution.
Thank you. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I want to just ask, and please, if anyone's got a question in the audience, please put it in the Q&A. So looking ahead to, say, the next decade, what is the area that interests you? What is, perhaps it's a risk, perhaps it's an opportunity, but what kind of things do you think you'd like to work on? I'll start with you, Luca, as your mic's open.
Also, there are many different things. I think from a technological point of view, I would say definitely things like quantum computing are very, very important. Literacy is, again, something that is very, very important. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and we need to make sure that people understand that it is out there and that they need to be literate enough to differentiate. But I think the main point is really the fact that cybersecurity, but also geopolitical security, is what in my area we would call a socio-technical problem. So it's not something that can be solved by technology alone. It's not something that can be solved by people alone. We really need the synergy between people and technology. And people means everybody, right? So from all the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier on. I think that is the main challenge, in a sense, how we not turn ourselves into machines, but how we morph a bit more the human and the technological aspects to achieve a higher degree of cybersecurity.
Thank you. Claudia, how about you? What's the one thing that you're interested in working on?
I was just mulling over it while listening to Luca. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping to work on is this question of anticipating the risks of AI, right? So very often, this is what is happening now, we realize that, there are risks associated with AI, whether, it's kind of in relation to what happens to the data, or in relation to the biases, the errors, the kind of forms of discrimination, quite late. So at the point in which a lot of these technologies are already embedded in decision making, are already embedded in a lot of the kind of the structures, the institutions. So it becomes really hard, and it takes a long time, really hard to kind of deal with the risks. So I'm hoping to actually think in a more anticipatory way, but maybe bring some storytelling, right? To kind of think, how do we make those risks palpable so that they speak to us, because a lot of the the data is not immediately it's not immediately palpable, right? So when something happens, when it is used in a particular way, when it is leaked, when it is used for surveillance, when it is used to target certain people, it kind of becomes palpable. But most of the time, it's very abstract and almost immaterial. We know it's not immaterial, of course, but it appears to be so. So I'm hoping to do some work to think about the risks of AI before it kind of gets fully implemented, before it kind of becomes fully fledged, embedded in institutions, particularly now as we see it gets more and more embedded in the work of public authorities. So I'm trying to kind of go back and look actually at the innovation stage where this kind of technologies are being, imagined, and try to see and patented at the same time, and try to see what some of the risks of AI are already there and are kind of seen as acceptable at this stage. And there's a question of, can we render them societally unacceptable at those early stages?
I see. I sense some collaborations brewing here. Tony, how about you? What's on the horizon for you?
I think we should stop calling artificial intelligence, and I use the phrase fast intelligence as well, because it's going to help us make decisions quicker. It helps us process data faster. It allows us to deal with facts which are highly complicated in a quicker way. But the thing I'm worried about is that, like other fast things like fast food and fast fashion, it might be fun in small doses, but too much of it may also prove to be far worse for us all than we might possibly think. So perhaps we should start talking about fast intelligence. And then we might start, as one of the questions in the chat says, how do we encourage people to become more literate? In the same way as we all know fast food's bad for us, perhaps too much fast intelligence might be as well.
Thank you. Yes, I've heard someone describe AI as digital polyester. So you think it's a great new exciting fabric, and then it turns out to be a bit cheap and sweaty. So there is that. Okay, that's all we've got time for. Let me just find our closing slides and try and share my screen yet again. See how that goes. And it's working. There we go. Technology is amazing. Hopefully you can see that now, so you'll be able to give feedback on this event. But I just want to thank our speakers for sharing their thoughts and their expertise. It's been a really valuable contribution to our series, and I'm really interested to see where the conversation goes next. The Digital Futures Institute will take a break from events over the summer. So our next event will be the Digital Futures of History on the 15th of October, and that's in person at King's, but also online. And we have a full series of events planned for the next academic year, including in November, the Digital Futures of Quantum, which will be held at the Science Gallery. And we're also looking at events on art, music and education. So please keep an eye out for those. If you'd like to find out more about our institute or join the mailing list or find out about other events, if you scan the QR code, it will take you to a feedback form, but you'll also be able to confirm if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. So thanks once again to our panel, who have been wonderful, and it's been great to hear you talk about this. And thank you all, you in the audience, for joining us this evening. Bye.